smuggling, armed rebellion, industrial espionage, monks. That is the real ingredient list of the drink in your glass. For 200 years, the Scottish government waged war on its own Highland farmers over it, not as a figure of speech. Soldiers, muskets, burned homes. In America, farmers took up arms against George Washington himself over a tax on it, and the newly minted nation's founding president personally led 13,000 troops into the field to crush them. A century later, a young Japanese chemist quietly copied the Scottish recipe in a notebook, carried it home, and his country went on to beat the Scots at their own drink in their own competitions. And a single cask, filled by a worker earning a day's wage and then forgotten in the dark, sold 90 years later for $1.9 million. Today, the global whiskey market is worth around $70 billion a year. Scotland ships a bottle of scotch every 2 seconds, around the clock, every day of the year. And the biggest whiskey drinking nation on earth is not Scotland or America. It is India, even though most of what fills those bottles is distilled from sugarcane and a Scot would refuse to call it whiskey at all. That sounds insane, but the fact that this one drink has been medicine, currency, a cause of wars, the target of spies, and an investment that beats the stock market tells you something. Whiskey was never just a drink. It never was. And it all began with the same 3 things every time: some grain, some water, and somebody with the patience to wait. So how did a medicinal spirit distilled by monks who had no grapes become the most argued over, most taxed, most romanticized liquid on earth? Who actually invented it? Ireland or Scotland? And how did a plague of insects in France hand the whole world to Scotland? To understand any of it, you have to start with alchemy. Distillation is not a European idea. The technique of heating a liquid, capturing the vapor, and condensing it back into something purer and stronger was refined above all in the medieval Islamic world by scholars and alchemists who were trying to isolate the essence of things, perfumes, medicines, the fundamental spirit inside matter. The very equipment carries the fingerprints of that history. The word alembic, the classic onion-shaped still, comes from Arabic. So does the word alcohol. These were tools of chemistry and medicine long before they were tools of pleasure. That knowledge travelled into Europe, and it landed, as so much learning did, in the monasteries. Monks were the scientists of medieval Europe, and they took up distilling with enthusiasm, producing what Latin called aqua vitae, the water of life, as a medicine. In the warm south, they distilled what they had, which was wine, and got brandy. But in Ireland and Scotland there were no vineyards. There was rain, and there was barley. So the monks of the north did the obvious thing. They took the fermented grain mash they already knew how to make, essentially a rough beer, and they distilled that instead. That single substitution is the whole invention. Whiskey is, in the simplest terms, distilled beer, and that is not a joke or a simplification. It is genuinely the whole recipe. And the Gaelic speakers of Ireland and Scotland translated the Latin aqua vitae directly into their own tongue. Whisky beatha in Irish, Whisky beatha in Scots Gaelic, water of life. English speakers, unable or unwilling to manage the pronunciation, mangled the first word down to uskabor, then to usky, and finally to the word we use today, whiskey. Every time you say it, you are saying a badly pronounced piece of medieval Gaelic that originally meant medicine. And it really was medicine at first. It was prescribed for aches and colds and poor circulation and low spirits, dispensed by monasteries as a genuine remedy. Which brings us to the question everyone wants settled. Who invented it? The Irish or the Scots? The honest answer is that nobody knows, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. On the written evidence, Ireland is ahead, and the first mention is not a recipe or a receipt. It is an obituary, a clan chieftain who died at Christmas in 1405 after taking, as the annals of Clonmacnoise put it, a surfeit of aqua vitae, the water of life. One translator added a grim little joke to the margin. In this case, it had proved to be the water of death. That entry comes almost a century before Scotland's famous record, the single dry line in the Royal Treasury accounts of 1494. 8 bowls of malt to Friar John Core, wherewith to make aqua vitae. And there is a detail in that line everyone misses. 8 bowls is something on the order of half a ton of grain, enough for hundreds of bottles. That is not a curious little experiment in a monastery cellar. It is a standing operation, already up and running at scale, for a king who plainly knew exactly what he was ordering. In other words, even the oldest written record is not the record of an invention. It is the record of something that had been going on for a long time already. A written record only proves when somebody bothered to write it down, not when people started doing it, and both traditions clearly grew out of the same monastic network sharing the same knowledge across a narrow sea. What we can say is that by the 1400s, both islands were making it, and both had been for a while. Then in the 1530s, an English king accidentally created the whisky industry. When Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, he threw thousands of monks out into the world with no income and one extremely marketable skill. Distilling escaped the cloister and went into farms, cottages, and back rooms across Ireland and Scotland. It stopped being a sacrament and became a trade, and, on countless small farms, a brilliantly practical way to deal with a surplus harvest. Grain rots, is heavy, and is hard to transport. Whisky does not rot, is worth far more per barrel, and can be carried over a mountain on a pony. For a farmer, distilling was a way of turning a bulky, perishable crop into portable, storable, sellable wealth. Governments noticed. Of course they did. In 1644, the Scottish Parliament put a tax on whisky, and with that single act it created something that would define the next 2 centuries. The illicit still. Highlanders, already resentful of a distant government, simply carried on distilling in hidden glens and shielings, moving the spirit by night, hiding it in coffins and under church pulpits and in the false bottoms of carts. An entire folk industry of smuggling grew up, complete with lookouts, signals, and a deep community contempt for the exciseman, the government officer sent to hunt the stills. It was cat and mouse played across a whole landscape, and it went on ferociously for the better part of 200 years. There is a delicious irony buried in that era. Scotland's national poet, Robert Burns, the man who wrote the songs and verses that still define Scottish sentiment about drink and freedom and a good dram, spent the last years of his life working as an exciseman, one of the very tax officers the smugglers loathed. He needed the salary, so the Bard of Scottish Liberty went out in the rain to inspect stills and collect duty on whisky, and then went home and wrote about it. Almost nothing about this drink is uncomplicated. If you are finding this video interesting, hit subscribe. We dig into the hidden histories behind drinks every week, and you will not want to miss what is coming next. Eventually the government worked out that it could not beat the smugglers, so it undercut them instead. The Excise Act of 1823 slashed the duty and offered a reasonable licence fee, making legal distilling genuinely worthwhile for the first time. It worked. Illicit stills faded, licensed distilleries multiplied, and a great many of the famous names on the shelf today date their legal existence to the years right after 1823. Some of them are, quite openly, former smuggling operations that simply filled in the paperwork. The most famous example is Glenlivet, whose founder was among the first to take out a licence under the new Act, an act of such open betrayal in the eyes of his former smuggling neighbours that he was reportedly given a pair of pistols and slept with them by his bed for years, genuinely afraid the resentful men of the Glen would burn him out. That is how bitter the old order was. Going legal was treated not as good business, but as treachery against the community. And yet the logic was unanswerable, and within a decade the caves emptied and the licensed distilleries filled, carrying with them the recipes and the know-how that 2 centuries of outlaw distilling had perfected. And then came the invention that changed everything, and it is soaked in irony. In 1830, an Irishman named Aeneas Coffey patented a new kind of still. Coffey had spent 25 years as an excise officer in Ireland, hunting the very illicit distillers he would later join. He had been badly beaten by moonshiners in the line of duty, then resigned and went into distilling himself. Refining an earlier Scottish design, he perfected the continuous column still, a tall machine that, unlike the traditional pot still, never had to stop. You fed it constantly and it produced constantly, generating a lighter, purer, far cheaper spirit in enormous volume. Coffee offered it to the great Dublin distillers first. They were the most respected whiskey makers in the world at the time, and they turned him down flat. Their rich, heavy, triple distilled pot, still whiskey, was the finest on earth, and they were not about to sully it with this thin industrial output. So coffee took his still to Scotland. The Scots embraced it, and in doing so invented the modern whiskey business. Cheap column still grain spirit could be blended with characterful, expensive, sometimes fierce pot still malt whiskey, producing something smooth, consistent, affordable, and endlessly reproducible. Blended Scotch was born. Great blending houses rose in Edinburgh and Glasgow, with names like Walker, Dewar, and Buchanan, and they went out and sold their product to an empire that spanned a quarter of the globe. An Irishman's rejected invention had just handed the world market to Scotland. An Irish whiskey, then the most admired spirit on the planet, began a long, painful slide it would not recover from for over a century. But the thing that truly detonated the whiskey boom was not a machine at all. It was an insect. In the 1860s, a tiny aphid called Phylloxera arrived in France from America and began eating the roots of European grapevines. Over the following decades, it destroyed the overwhelming majority of French vineyards. And when the vines died, so did brandy. Cognac, which had been the default respectable spirit of the entire Western world, the drink of gentlemen everywhere, simply ran out. Into that enormous gaping vacuum walked Scotch whiskey, cheap, plentiful, well-branded, and suddenly available. Whiskey did not outcompete brandy so much as inherit the world from it after a bug ate its supply chain. Fashion followed necessity, and it never really went back. The boom that followed was so wild it produced a crash. The 1890s saw a speculative frenzy in whiskey, culminating in the spectacular collapse of a famous Leith blending firm whose owners had been financing the party with creative accounting and, memorably, publicity stunts involving parrots. The bust ruined investors and left Scotland sitting on lakes of unsold spirit. Out of that mess came one of the most peculiar legal battles in the history of food and drink. The question of what whiskey actually is. In 1905, a London Borough Council prosecuted publicans for selling blended whiskey, arguing it was not the real thing. The malt distillers insisted that only pot still malt deserved the name. The blenders insisted their product was whiskey too. The matter escalated all the way to a royal commission, which sat 37 times and finally reported in 1909 with a decision that shaped the entire modern industry. Whiskey is a spirit distilled from a grain mash saccharified by malt, and Scotch whiskey is that spirit made in Scotland. Full stop. The blenders had won completely. It is why your bottle of blended Scotch is legally, unarguably whiskey, and it was settled by a government committee. While all that was going on, whiskey was writing an entirely different and far more violent story in America. Scots-Irish immigrants had carried distilling to the American frontier, where they found rye and later corn, growing in abundance, and the same old problem of moving a bulky crop to market across mountains. Whiskey was the answer, and on the frontier it became something close to currency, traded and paid out in place of coin. So when the brand new United States government, desperate to pay off its war debts, imposed a tax on distilled spirits in 1791, the frontier exploded. The tax had to be paid in cash, which frontier farmers who lived by barter simply did not have. Tax collectors were tarred and feathered. In July 1794, hundreds of armed men burned the home of a regional tax inspector near Pittsburgh, and thousands marched on the city. President George Washington's response was to raise a militia of around 13,000 men, larger than most armies he had commanded in the Revolution, and ride out at their head. It remains the only time a sitting American president has personally led troops in the field. The rebels melted away before he arrived. The Whiskey Rebellion was over, and the young federal government had proved it could enforce its own laws. America's first constitutional crisis was, essentially, an argument about whiskey. Meanwhile, in Kentucky and Tennessee, American distillers were stumbling onto something distinctive. They used corn, which gives a sweeter spirit, and at some point they began shipping it in barrels whose insides had been charred. Nobody is quite sure why the charring started. The explanations range from sterilizing reused barrels to a happy accident with a fire. But the effect was transformative. The burnt layer of oak acts as a filter and a flavor factory, and over years in the heat of a Kentucky warehouse, it gives the spirit its color and its vanilla and caramel sweetness. Bourbon was born. Even the name is a small mystery, most often traced to Bourbon County in Kentucky, though the exact route is argued over to this day. And here is a fact check worth having, because almost everyone gets it wrong. Bourbon does not have to come from Kentucky. It has to be made in the United States, from a mash of at least 51% corn and aged in new charred oak containers. That is essentially it. The overwhelming majority of it is made in Kentucky, and Kentucky has every right to be proud. But a bourbon made in Texas or New York is still legally bourbon. Similarly, Tennessee whiskey like Jack Daniel's meets the bourbon requirements but is filtered through sugar maple charcoal before barreling, a step that makes it, by its maker's insistence, its own thing. Then Prohibition nearly killed the whole American industry. From 1920, distilleries closed, expertise evaporated, and stocks aged out or vanished. But there was a loophole, and it is a wonderful one. Whiskey remained legal as medicine. A doctor could write you a prescription, a pharmacy could fill it, and a small handful of companies, just 6 of them, were licensed to keep bottling for medicinal purposes. The prescriptions came on official government forms. A patient was typically allowed a pint every 10 days, and the conditions it supposedly treated ranged from anxiety to the common cold. It was, of course, a national wink. Millions of essentially healthy Americans discovered they had ailments that only whiskey could soothe, and the pharmacy counter became the respectable face of a thirsty country. One drugstore chain in particular expanded explosively during exactly these years, growing from a couple of dozen shops to hundreds, and while the causes were surely broader, the medicinal whiskey trade did it no harm at all. Prescriptions were written in enormous numbers, and the drink that began its life as a monastic medicine ended up, 600 years later, being dispensed once again from behind a counter on a doctor's note. When Prohibition ended, American whiskey was on its knees, and it would take decades, and eventually the bourbon boom of our own century, to fully recover. The other great whiskey story of the 20th century began with a young Japanese chemist getting on a boat. In 1918, Masataka Taketsuru, the son of a sake brewing family, travelled to Scotland to study chemistry at Glasgow and to learn distilling from the inside, apprenticing at Scottish distilleries and filling 2 notebooks with everything he could observe about how whiskey was actually made. Those notebooks are now regarded as the founding documents of an entire national industry. He also fell in love with a Scottish woman, Rita Cowan, and married her in 1920 over the objections of both families, and she returned with him to Japan. His timing was terrible and then perfect. The company that had sponsored him abandoned its whiskey plans in a post-war slump, but a businessman named Shinjiro Torii wanted to build Japan's first real whiskey distillery and needed the one man in the country who genuinely understood how. Together they built Yamazaki in 1923. Their first release flopped. The Japanese public found it too smoky and strange. Taketsuru eventually left to build his own distillery at Yoichi in Hokkaido, chosen because its cold, damp, sea-blown climate reminded him of Scotland. His company became Nikka. Torii's became Suntory. Between them they created Japanese whiskey. And there is a human story threaded through all of it that Japan has never forgotten. The Scottish woman Taketsuru married Rita Cowan, sailed east with him in 1920, despite the strong disapproval of both their families, learned the language, and built her whole adult existence in a country about as far from her Glasgow childhood as it was possible to get, standing beside him through every failure and every fresh start. Decades later, long after her death, Japan's national broadcaster turned the story of that marriage into an enormously popular morning drama series, and a whole nation followed the tale of the girl from near Glasgow, who had helped give Japan one of the world's great whiskies. And then, decades later, the student humiliated the teacher. Japanese whiskies began winning the world's top awards, and in 2015 a Yamazaki was named the best whiskey in the world by the most widely read guide in the business, with no Scotch in the top rankings at all. Scotland, understandably, took it badly. Demand for Japanese whiskey exploded so violently that distilleries ran out of aged stock and had to withdraw their famous bottles from sale, because whiskey is the one product where you cannot simply make more. If you did not lay it down 20 years ago, it does not exist. That is the strange tyranny at the heart of this drink. Time. A whiskey spends years, often decades, sitting quietly in a wooden barrel, and that barrel does most of the work. The great majority of the colour and a huge share of the flavour of any whiskey comes from the wood, not the still. And all the while, a portion evaporates through the oak every year and drifts away into the air. A lost distillers have always called, rather beautifully, the angel's share. Over a long maturation, the angels can take a third of the barrel or more. Every old whiskey you have ever tasted exists because somebody decades ago made a bet on a future they might not see, and then let the angels drink their cut. Though it is worth puncturing one myth here. Older is not automatically better. Whiskey does not improve indefinitely. Leave it too long in an aggressive cask and the wood bullies the spirit into oblivion. Age statements sell bottles, but the greatest whiskies are the ones taken out at the right moment, not the ones left in longest. The modern industry has had its own crashes. In the 1980s, wild overproduction left Scotland with an infamous whisky loch and forced distilleries to close, some of them legendary names that were mothballed or demolished. In one of history's cruelest jokes, the whiskey from several of those closed distilleries is now among the most valuable liquid on earth, precisely because no more of it will ever be made. Meanwhile, single malt, which had been treated as merely an ingredient for blending, was repackaged and sold on its own as a luxury product, and an entire culture of connoisseurship was born around it, complete with tasting notes, regional maps, and gentle snobbery. Today, whiskey is a genuinely global business, and the shape of it would astonish a Highland smuggler. The largest whiskey market on earth by volume is not Scotland or America, but India, whose best-selling brands sell in numbers that dwarf the famous Scottish names, though with a caveat worth noting. Much of what is sold as whiskey in India is made from molasses, and would not legally qualify as whiskey in Europe. Indian single malts, meanwhile, are now winning international awards outright. Taiwan makes superb whiskey. So do Australia, Sweden, France, and dozens of others. And at the very top of the market, single bottles of ancient Scotch now change hands at auction for well over £2 million, which means the most expensive whiskey in the world costs more than most people's homes. And it is, at bottom, distilled beer that sat in a barrel. So the next time you pour a whiskey and watch it move in the glass, that amber, ordinary, unremarkable thing, remember what it actually carries. It carries Arab alchemists chasing the essence of matter, and monks with no grapes distilling their own beer into medicine. It carries a clan chief dead at Christmas in 1405, and a friar in 1494 collecting half a ton of the king's barley. It carries smugglers moving casks through Highland glens by night and hiding them under pulpits. It carries an Irish exciseman whose invention was rejected in Dublin and made Scotland rich, and an insect in a French vineyard that emptied the world's brandy glasses and filled them with Scotch instead. It carries a president on horseback, riding against his own farmers, a charred barrel in a Kentucky warehouse, a prescription pad in Prohibition, and a young Japanese chemist with 2 notebooks and a Scottish wife. And it carries time itself, years of it, sitting in silence in the dark while the angels take their share. The monastery medicine that started rebellions and now sells for millions is sitting in your glass right now, warm and golden and utterly ordinary, waiting to be noticed. Whiskey was never just a drink. It never was, and it never will be. If this story surprised you, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden histories behind drinks. We have got a lot more coming.